I stood in the hallway, still clutching the damp towel around my hips, listening to the sound of the front door shutting behind him. A suitcase thudded on the tile, keys landed in the glass bowl near the entrance, and then came that silence, too familiar, too domestic, too final. He was here again. He hadn't been home in years, not really. Always passing through, always in a rush, always somewhere else to be. But now he was staying, temporarily, of course. That's what my husband said, with the same indifferent tone he used to talk about car repairs or the news. Just for a few weeks. He's helping with the lake house. And just like that, I became the hostess again. Not the wife, not the woman, just the hostess. When I walked back toward the living room, he was already sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, scrolling through his phone like it owed him something. He looked older, leaner, still young, but carved from something heavier than before. I told myself not to stare. Our first words were dry, polite. He called me you instead of her or mom or anything familial. I asked about work. He answered in syllables. My husband chimed in with some half-hearted joke about us getting along too well already. I laughed. It felt like swallowing glass. The first real moment happened 2 days later. Morning light poured into the kitchen like warm syrup, stretching across the floor toward my bare feet. I was reaching for the mug on the top shelf, and the hem of my robe had lifted just enough. I didn't notice right away, but I felt it, the air shift, the quiet pause behind me. I turned. He looked away, slow, deliberate, and didn't apologize. That night, I stared at myself in the mirror longer than usual. I opened the drawer and touched the folded silk I hadn't worn in years. Not for lack of opportunity, just lack of reason. My husband hadn't looked at me that way in longer than I could count. And now someone had, and that someone wasn't. I wore it the next morning under a thick sweater, irrationally aware of how the silk kissed my skin with each breath I took. I poured coffee and asked him about his plans for the day, noticing how he looked at me a second too long before answering. My husband read the newspaper between us, utterly unaware. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was tension. It was the raw, magnetic sort of presence that made me stand straighter, speak softer, breathe deeper. I found myself brushing my hair slower, choosing clothes not for function but for feeling. Red lipstick on a Tuesday, perfume for no reason. I started setting the breakfast table even before I brushed my teeth. The hallway became a stage. The staircase, an arena. Each narrow passing between us now held weight. Accidental touches began to feel intentional. A shoulder, a wrist, the back of his hand grazing mine as we reached for the same plate. None of it could be explained. All of it could be denied. One afternoon, I was sorting laundry in the basement. The low ceiling, the hum of the dryer, the dust, mundane. He came down looking for something. I don't remember what, but he stopped when he saw me sorting laundry, my blouse slightly rumpled. There was a stillness in that moment, a hanging breath neither of us released. He said, "You look different." I asked how. He shook his head, smiled without humor, and said, "Less tired." It wasn't a compliment, it was a diagnosis. That night I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching my husband undress, his back to me. He moved like someone rehearsing. A routine. Fold. Hanger. Drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the lace cling to my thighs beneath my robe. I wanted him to look at me, not glance. Look. He didn't.
We made love out of obligation, quiet, efficient, prédictable.
I closed my eyes and tried to find something to hold on to, a spark, a scent, a heartbeat, but all I felt was the cool air on my neck and the sound of the clock ticking. The next morning, the first thing I noticed was his cologne. Not my husband's, his. The scent lingered in the hallway, mixed with coffee and sun, a reminder, a challenge. Later that day, I caught myself standing by the window, watching him mow the lawn. He took off his shirt halfway through. I told myself to look away. I didn't. My reflection in the glass watched with me. I knew I should be ashamed. I wasn't. I was curious, alive, awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Something was starting, and even though I didn't know where it would lead, I also knew I wasn't going to stop it. Not yet. The morning was cool despite the clear sky. The kitchen smelled of toast and coffee, and as always, I was the first awake, patting around in my slippers, performing the same quiet rituals. I wore a soft beige pajama set, thin and barely opaque, and wrapped a heavy robe over it, not out of modesty, but out of habit. Still, I was acutely aware of how the fabric clung to me beneath it, a private whisper against my skin, as if reminding me I was still a woman, not just a wife. He walked in barefoot, hair messy, eyes heavy with sleep, but alert. He mumbled a morning, and went straight to the sink. I didn't answer. I just watched him, his hand braced against the counter, veins lining his forearm like rope under taut skin. The simplicity of that posture, effortless, unperformed, felt almost inappropriate to look at. Youth has a way of being unapologetically honest. My husband came down minutes later, same pajamas he's worn for over a year, the ones I bought him last Christmas. He kissed the side of my head and sat at the table. I felt his lips touch my temple, but nothing stirred in me.
No warmth, no reflex.
Just the familiar tick of routine being completed, one check mark on a long list of... The conversation at breakfast was predictable. News, traffic, weekend rain forecasts. He spoke more to his son than to me, and I was grateful for that. It gave me room to watch, to observe, to compare, to feel the subtle invisible things I couldn't explain, not even to myself. Later I had errands to run, groceries, a hair appointment, the post office, all mundane. He offered to drive me casually, like it didn't matter, but it did. I said yes before I could think of a reason to say no. In the car, I sat quietly, the seatbelt pulling slightly at my coat. At every stoplight, my thigh nudged closer to his, and I didn't move it away. He turned on music without asking. A low, gravelly male voice sang about things women weren't supposed to say aloud. I stared out the window, but I could feel his breath, the way his fingers tightened and relaxed around the steering wheel. I didn't need to look to know that I was being noticed. We parked near my office. He didn't immediately reach for the keys. I adjusted my coat, grabbed my bag, and was about to open the door when he spoke. Not loudly, but clearly, he said my name. For the first time, I turned. His face was close, not close enough to touch, but close enough that it changed the air. The space between us thickened, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We didn't move, just stared, caught in something unspoken and unsafe. Then he leaned forward, slowly, carefully, like someone stepping onto thin ice. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, barely there. The kiss wasn't bold, it was uncertain, quiet, testing the air between us. And yet, it lit something in me that had been silent for too long. I didn't pull away. My body leaned in before my mind gave it permission. For a moment, I forgot about consequences, about names, about roles. There was only his mouth, his breath, and the overwhelming sensation of being. I broke the kiss first, not because I regretted it, but because I couldn't handle how much I wanted more. My heart was hammering, not in my chest, but in my throat. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. I opened the door and stepped out. The lobby of the office building felt cold and sterile.
Too bright and too loud.
Every paper, every phone ringing, every voice, it all felt distant, plastic. I sat at my desk for hours, reading the same sentences, unable to process any of them. My mind was still back there, in that car, in that kiss. Not out of guilt, but because something had been awakened. What surfaced wasn't regret. It was a quiet ache, hard to ignore. I walked home instead of calling a ride. I needed the time. Each block, each step was like shedding a layer of denial. By the time I reached the front door, I was certain of only one thing. If it happened again, I wouldn't resist. That evening, my husband came home and wrapped his arms around me from behind. I flinched, not because of surprise, but because my body no longer responded. It wasn't rejection, it was absence. Nothing registered. Later before bed, I opened my closet and reached for the lace lingerie I hadn't touched in years. Not for him, for me. For the version of myself I thought I'd buried under chores and anniversaries. I wore it beneath my robe as I brushed my hair, standing in front of the mirror, studying my reflection like a stranger. The silk felt like a secret I carried close, a secret I didn't want to confess, because I wanted it to happen again. And that terrified me less than the idea that it might not. I had barely slept, not because of guilt, but because of how vividly I could still feel his lips. Soft, certain, terrifying. I kept replaying it, not in search of meaning, but in search of sensation. There was a texture to it I couldn't forget. The slight tremble in his breath, the coolness of his skin, the heat that settled between my ribs like a slow
Morning came too soon.
My husband was leaving town for 2 days. An annual construction expo, 2 states over.
It wasn't a secret.
It wasn't sudden. He had mentioned it a dozen times. I had nodded, smiled, pretended to care, but this time I cared in a different way. Not because of what it meant for him, but because of what it meant for me. For us, I cooked breakfast, though I wasn't hungry. The egg sizzled too loudly, the toast smelled burnt. He packed in the living room while I stood in the kitchen, feeling my heart rise into my throat each time he called my name from across the house. I answered with practiced cheerfulness. Nothing sounded off, but everything felt different. As he stood by the door, suitcase in hand, he kissed my forehead and said, "You'll be okay here?" I nodded. "Of course," I replied, smiling just right. He smiled too, with that familiar weightless warmth, completely unaware, completely trusting. When the door shut behind him, I didn't move. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the space he had just vacated. The silence left in his absence was a breathing thing, expanding and contracting through the walls, the furniture, the floorboards. I walked barefoot to the kitchen and made a second cup of coffee, this one for myself. It tasted stronger. I needed it to be. He came down late, showered, dressed, cleaner than usual. I noticed his hair was still damp, the scent of his cologne blending with the warmth of his skin. He didn't sit right away, just leaned against the counter, watching me butter toast like it was something fragile. I didn't ask if he wanted any. I didn't need to. "I'll be in the garage later," he said casually. "Dad left a bunch of stuff in boxes." I nodded, barely looking up. "Let me know if you need help," I murmured, then turned to the sink, letting the hot water rush over the dishes until steam clouded the window. He went out half an hour later. I waited 10 minutes before following, not because I was hesitant, but because I needed that pause to gather myself. I had changed into jeans and a loose cardigan over a camisole, no bra. I told myself it was because of the heat. The excuse barely lasted the walk through the hallway. The garage was a mess of dusty boxes, tools, old furniture, and forgotten things that smelled like time. He had cleared a small corner and was crouched near a box of old newspapers and tool catalogs. I stood by the doorway a moment before stepping in. He turned his head briefly, offered a soft, "Hey," then kept working. I didn't answer, just picked up a smaller box and knelt beside him, brushing cobwebs from the lid. We worked in silence for a while, him on one side, me on the other, our backs to each other, the air heavy with the scent of cardboard and oil. And then his voice, low and unexpectedly personal. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. I paused, hand frozen on an old photo album. I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. "No," I said, "that's not how it works." My voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He looked at me then, over his shoulder, eyes narrow with something unreadable. "But do you ever want to?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. He waited, then turned away. It was just a question, but it wasn't. He pulled out an old framed photo, me, my husband, and him at some graduation. We were all smiling. I barely remembered the day. He handed it to me and said, "We looked happy." "We were," I said. "Were." He didn't press, just let the word hang there like smoke. Later, we took a break. I brought out cold lemonade and 2 glasses. We sat on the back steps, not talking. The sun was high, casting slow-moving shadows across the lawn. I watched the sweat bead along his collarbone, the way he rested his forearms on his knees, fingers in. It's strange, he said suddenly.
Being here like this.
It feels like everything's exactly the same, but also off. I didn't look at him. I stared at the grass, the fence, the hose coiled in a heap. That's how houses work, I said. They don't move. We do. When I went inside, I didn't go straight to the kitchen. I went to the mirror in the hallway and stared at my reflection. There was color in my cheeks I hadn't seen in years, a flush that wasn't from heat. My lips looked fuller, my eyes more alert. I looked like a version of myself I hadn't met in a long time. That evening, he helped me with dinner. My hands brushed his twice. He didn't move. The third time, I left mine there for a second longer. He looked at me, and there was no hesitation in his eyes this time, only patience, only presence. We ate with plates too close together on the kitchen island, the air between us charged like storm clouds on the edge of breaking. Afterward, as I loaded the dishwasher, I felt his gaze again. The way his eyes traveled, not disrespectful, not casual, like someone seeing color for the first time after living in grayscale. I didn't speak.
Il let the silence say it.
That night, I lay in bed beside a man who was miles away in his sleep, while just down the hall, another man couldn't sleep at all. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the worst part of myself. Felt like the truest. The following morning unfolded slowly, like something being unwrapped layer by layer. The sky outside had that pale winter light, brilliant but cold, and the house felt too quiet, as if even the walls had begun holding their breath. I stood by the window in the hallway, staring at the leafless trees and the neighbor's dog barking at nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of my life, quietly and permanently, like a crack forming beneath still ice. My husband wouldn't be back until the I had said that out loud to no one in particular more than once that morning. I wasn't waiting for anyone to hear me. I was just saying it to the air, as if naming his absence made it more legitimate. I cleaned the countertops twice, rearranged the books on the coffee table, changed the water in the vase even though the flowers had already wilted. I wasn't restless. I was prepared. I didn't know for what, but I felt it coming. Mid-morning, I found the Christmas decorations tucked away in the hall closet, a dusty box full of tangled lights, mismatched ornaments, old holiday cards. Normally, I would have waited for my husband to return so we could do it together, like we always did. But nothing about this week felt like always. He came downstairs while I was testing the string lights across the back of the couch. His steps were slow, cautious, almost too quiet for a man his size. I knew he'd been watching me from the landing for a few seconds before entering the room. I didn't acknowledge it. I just kept untangling the lights, pretending not to notice the way my own hands shook slightly. He walked over without saying anything and started helping, plugging in the other end of the string and holding it out so I could inspect the bulbs. We worked in silence again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of unfinished thoughts, avoided questions, eyes that met for too long and looked away too quickly. I had chosen a dress that morning I hadn't worn in over a year. Dark blue, soft cotton, fitted enough to remind me of my waistline. I hadn't worn a bra beneath it, partly because the neckline didn't require it, partly because I wanted to feel the movement. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the shape of me each time I bent forward to retrieve another ornament. He didn't speak, but his gaze was steady, thoughtful, like a hand hovering just above my skin. At one point, I dropped a glass ornament. It shattered, sharp. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Fine." Just startled me. He bent down to gather the shards and I watched the curve of his spine, the quiet focus in his movements. I should have stopped staring, but I didn't. Something in me was dissolving, a boundary, an agreement, an identity. I no longer knew what role I was playing. When the tree was finally lit, the room looked warmer, softer. He stood back and admired it, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched. I was standing beside him, closer than I needed to be. I said something about how my husband always put the star on last, and he glanced at me with something sharp in his eyes, something like disbelief. "Why didn't you wait for him?" he asked, but it didn't sound like an accusation. "Because I didn't want to," I said, and the word surprised even me. I wasn't making a statement. I was telling the truth. We sat on the couch afterward, tired but not relaxed. I tucked one leg beneath me, smoothing my dress without thinking. He was watching again. I could feel it in the way the room shifted around his stillness, a kind of quiet gravity. I reached for a box of old photos and handed it to him, a distraction, a deflection. But when he opened it and started flipping through, the air didn't ease, it thickened. He paused at a photo, one of me and my husband on the beach, both of us laughing. The wind in my hair, his arm around my shoulders. We looked young. I couldn't remember if we were happy. "Did he take that?" he asked. "I think so," I said. That was before everything got quiet. He nodded slowly, then put the photo aside without comment. I watched his profile, how his jaw moved slightly when he swallowed, how his hand rested too close to my knee. I didn't shift away. Later that afternoon, the heater kicked on and filled the room with soft white noise. I sat with a book I wasn't reading, my mind wandering, my body still humming from the